both Street Fighter and the King of Fighters were, and still are, beloved 2D fighting game series that enjoyed success all around the world. But in the late 90s, the arcade fighting game scene was changing. Heavily. There were still successful games coming out, but as home consoles grew in popularity, the explosion in popularity the fighting game genre enjoyed with the release of 1991 Street Fighter II was fading away rapidly. Capcom's finances didn't suffer too much, however, as they had successful home console franchises like Devil May Cry, Resident Evil, Mega Man, etc. for them to fall back on in the home console market, but the same can't be said for their cousin SNK. SNK did have both home and portable systems, but these were never as successful as the products being shipped by a much larger company like Nintendo, for example, so they always ended up playing second fiddle in the market. The company was making great games, but they failed to adapt to the changing market as they had always possessed an arcade-first spirit. It's no secret to fans of the fighting game genre that SNK has suffered financially for many years, and they even declared bankruptcy at one point. Their situation was so bad that on the 13th of June 2000, SNK shut down in America, Canada, and Europe. Internally at both Capcom and SNK during the 90s, there was a bit of a back and forth rivalry going on. Capcom had Ryu, so SNK made Ryo. Street Fighter added a parry, SNK introduced the Just Defend. You got T-Hawk, we got a Tizok. Going back even further, game director and creator of Street Fighter himself, Takashi Nishiyama, left Capcom in the 80s to work for SNK, developing some of their fighting games. After SNK's finances went down the drain in the 90s, Nishiyama, possessed with an intricate knowledge of both Capcom, SNK, and their respective fighting games, had an idea. Why don't we make a versus SNK game? With that, we now know some context behind the first Capcom vs SNK game. Released in 2000, Capcom vs SNK Millennium Fight 2000 was the first ever Capcom developed crossover between these two juggernauts, and at first it was seen as revolutionary. A crossover between Capcom and SNK? Two rivals that went out of their way to mock each other in their games? Really? Over the years, the game's sequel has proven to be the more popular and competitively viable of the bunch, but I decided to analyze the first game to see where it all began. It's been over 2 full decades since this game was released, so let's strap in and analyze Capcom vs SNK. As this is a fighting game crossover between the two companies, it goes without saying that the character roster consists of figures from both Capcom and SNK's fighters. But it wasn't always this way, however, as according to page 38 of Edge Magazine's issue 78, we can read that Leon from Resident Evil and Mega Man were supposed to be in the game, as well as stages from Street Fighter III Third Strike, although to be honest, these were most likely used for testing purposes and were never intended to be in the final game. As for who and what did make it into the final game, the Capcom side consists entirely of Street Fighter characters, except for Morrigan, who represents Darkstalkers. SNK's side of the roster is a bit more varied, as it contains characters from Fatal Fury, the King of Fighters, and Samurai Showdown. Games like Rival Schools, Final Fight, Psycho Soldier, and The Last Blade were represented in the second game, but this isn't the case here. The roster is very simplistic and a tad bit predictable, but since this was the first major crossover between these two companies, it makes sense that the game strictly focuses on these companies' A-list characters and franchises. What caught lots of people's attention were the appearances of the SNK characters. Both Capcom and SNK were using pixel art for their games in the 90s, but they looked noticeably different as the artists at both studios had their own unique art styles, so seeing the Capcom art team draw and animate the SNK characters was a shock for some. I was definitely surprised. Capcom's first crossover game came out prior to me joining the company, but I was excited when I saw the announcement where characters like Terry and Kyo Kusanagi were presented in Capcom's pixel art style. I've heard that both Capcom and SNK's graphic artists were in touch prior to the release of the game. Former SNK and Capcom worker Toyohisa Tanabe was the pixel art supervisor on the game, and he played a major role in successfully blending the company's art styles together. Even the out-of-the-game character renders continue the reverse art style, as while the SNK characters in-game look like they were made by Capcom, the Capcom characters in the renders look like they were made by SNK. With realistic proportions and facial features created by Capcom's Kinu Nishimura and SNK's Shinkiro, it's truly wild to see beloved Street Fighter characters look like this, and the game's depiction of Morrigan is a standout to me. She looks beautiful. As for how difficult the procedure was, Tanabe recalls, "According to what I heard, when they were making Capcom vs SNK, the Capcom designers were all vying for the opportunity to design certain characters. Let me design a Yoriyagami, give me my Shiranui! So no, I wouldn't say that it was hard to blend together or anything. I think SNK felt comfortable putting these characters in the hands of the Capcom designers. It was so nice seeing the characters that we had designed get reinterpreted by the people at Capcom, and as a game too, I really loved it. At the time, it felt like the only way we could ever top this would be if we made a truly Olympic-scale fighting game. Something crazy like Sega vs Namco vs SNK vs Capcom.
Round 1, fight!
Although the game was developed primarily by Capcom, Capcom vs SNK uses SNK's classic 4-button control scheme for a total of 2 punches and 2 kicks. Brand new to the game were its 2 major gameplay hooks. The first of which is the Groove system, which makes the characters operate under the Extra mode found in the King of Fighters series from 94 to 98, or the Capcom Groove, which makes the characters play like they're from Street Fighter Alpha. Seeing classic SNK characters operate under the rules and systems of the Capcom Groove and vice versa was something completely foreign, and it must have been downright bizarre to witness back when the game launched. The choice given to players over which groove they'd like to select is an interesting one, but according to James Chen, Capcom vs SNK definitely felt like it was more Street Fighter than King of Fighters, because even though there was the SNK groove, it wasn't very good. For the most part, it felt like the SNK characters were put into a Street Fighter game. The second major gameplay hook is the ratio system. Every character is worth a certain amount of points depending on their strength and overall popularity. You have 4 points, and you must buy your team without going over 4. So for example, if I wanted to play a team with Blanca, Cammy, and E Honda, that's gonna work fine. But if I wanted to play as Ryu, Zangief, and Sakura, that goes over the limit, so I'm not allowed to use it. Capcom incorporated this ratio system out of a desire to provide players with multiple playstyles and to make them think about which teams to use. Do you have a smaller team with stronger characters, or a larger team with weaker characters? Former Capcom veteran Noritaka Funamizu explains, I had heard of the King of Fighters, and just from the title, I had my own impression about what kind of game it would be. It sounded really cool. The Neo Geo had all these different fighting games, you know, so wouldn't it be great if you mixed all their strengths together in one single game? That's what I imagined King of Fighters to be, but when I actually played it, it turned out to be totally different. So when we were making Capcom vs SNK, I wanted to make it more like the King of Fighters I had imagined in my head. This may sound good in theory, but as Seth Killian put it, it didn't quite work out unfortunately. Compared to previous games, CVS1 did offer a big cast and a lot of system choices, but most of the options presented were just bad choices. As players realized this, the result was long matches between low-powered characters, filled with as many as 7 breaks between rounds. CVS1 was not a bad game, but its slow, low-stakes style created a black hole where hype went to die. As for how the game was received, overall it was a success. It's a bit challenging to find sales figures for the game, but I did find that on October 1st, 2000, Japanese publication Game Machine reported that it was the most successful arcade game of the month, and it was listed as their second best fighting game of the year, only losing to Guilty Gear X. Western reviewers appreciated the home console release Capcom vs SNK Pro for its unlockable features, crisp animation, and fun gameplay. The roster was criticized by some for over-relying on Street Fighter and the King of Fighters characters, and James Chen recalls that the 4-button layout was disapproved of by the more hardcore Street Fighter crowd who were used to 6 buttons, but overall the game was a success. When it was all said and done, the game received a sequel the very next year, and while not a sales blockbuster, Capcom vs SNK 2 has truly solidified itself as a classic fighting game that people still enjoy all these years later. When it comes to the first entry, while it was truly revolutionary for breaking down barriers between both Capcom and SNK as companies, the game hasn't been remembered too fondly. It has received some tournament support in recent years, but to be honest, it's simply been eclipsed in popularity by its sequel. Honestly, I still find it baffling that CVS1 was even made at all. From the rivalry between the two companies, SNK's waning popularity and finances, and the decline of arcade games in general towards the late 90s and early 2000s, Capcom vs SNK is a game that shouldn't have happened. But it did, and thankfully so. I believe the series has given birth to a truly die-hard fanbase who loves and supports it and continues to play it to this very day. And even though the series has been kind of dead for over 20 years, hey, here's hoping that Capcom and SNK can reunite once again to give us the long-awaited third entry.